On Wednesday evening, the doorbell rang at 9:45, marking the start of my wife's deception coming undone, unbeknownst to her. I answered the door to find a man and a woman in slightly dated business attire, giving off an air that suggested they were law enforcement, not just from their appearance but also because it coincided with the week Frank and I had planned to settle our score. "Good evening, sir," said the woman. "Are you Mr. Douglas Franklin?" "Yes, I'm Doug Franklin." "Who are you, and what brings you to my doorstep unannounced at this hour?" I played dumb, though I had a sinking feeling about what was coming next. "Who's there, honey?" called out Joyce, my wife, her voice betraying nerves that had plagued her all evening. But that's another story. She entered the room from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart," I replied, masking my irritation. Joyce stood beside me, wearing a puzzled expression. "Are you Mrs. Joyce Franklin?" the woman asked, redirecting her attention to my wife, while the man beside her remained silent and indifferent to the unfolding drama. "Look," I said, trying to feign annoyance and cover my inner glee at what I suspected this was about, "you have been asking questions here on my front porch and have yet to tell me just who you are and what this is about." With a resigned sigh, the woman withdrew her hand from her shoulder bag, and the man behind her pulled his hand out of the inside pocket of his sport jacket. When they both flipped their hands in what appeared to be a synchronized and practiced manner, 2 police badges caught the illumination of the front porch light fixture. I heard Joyce, my wife, groan to herself as the woman said, "I am Detective Sergeant O'Neill, and this is Detective Scurry. We are investigating an assault that occurred earlier today, and we would like to ask you and Mrs. Franklin some questions." I had practiced my put-on expression of surprise a couple of times over the past few days in front of the mirror, and now was the opportunity to see if it went over without arousing any suspicions. "What assault? And why would you believe that my wife or I would know anything about such a thing?" I said with rising irritation, also well practiced in my expression and voice. I glanced around to look at Joyce and saw that her face had lost all color and that she wore an expression of stark terror. She was looking away from all of us and appeared to be about to hyperventilate. The male detective spoke up at this point. "The assault took place early this afternoon, resulting in severe trauma to the victim." In one of his few lucid moments before he went in for surgery, he identified Joyce Franklin as the primary witness to what happened to him. This has also been corroborated by several other witnesses at the scene of the event in question. Still pretending ignorance and surprise, I said, "Who was this victim?" "I mean, my wife, the primary witness." "What?" At this, I paused just as an honestly startled husband should pause and continued to play the role of the ignorant fool in this part of the scene that was now bringing my wife's little secret world down around her ears. "Mrs. Franklin, what is the nature of your relationship with Mr. William Jardo, and what were you and he doing together when he was assaulted in the back parking lot of the Newton Motel on King Street this afternoon?" asked Detective Sergeant O'Neill. Well, that was blatant. She was obviously going for shock and awe. There it was, out in the open. No getting away from it now. Joyce let out an anguished sob, and it appeared as if she were going to pass out. I just turned my head slowly back toward my wife and looked at her with an expression of curiosity and surprise. At least, I hoped I did okay with those looks, that slowly turned to alarm and then anger as she began to bawl openly and back away slowly from me. Friday, Frank. Fridays are usually a bit less hectic than the other workdays in the week, so I was not particularly busy that day in the middle of the afternoon when my secretary Jan told me that I had a call on line 1. "Frank Simmons," I said. "Mr. Simmons, this is Deputy Gibson with the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. Could I schedule a few moments of your time this afternoon or evening?" said the husky voice on the other end of the call. "Deputy Gibson, I don't understand. Just what is the nature of your request?" I asked, already realized that Doug must have held up his end of the bargain if I was getting a call like this. "I'd rather wait and tell you in person, Mr. Simmons." Could I drop by your residence later to speak to you this afternoon or evening? Also, it might be best if Mrs. Simmons is available for this as well. In fact, she really needs to be there for this meeting, he said somewhat evasively. I was glad that he could not see the smile of satisfaction on my face as I said, well, I must say that I am confused but curious. You may come by. Is 7 o'clock okay? My wife still works during the day, but she is usually at home in the late afternoon and evening. We both should be home by the time you get there. 7 p.m. it is, Mr. Simmons. See you then, and then the connection was broken. I hung up the phone, swung my chair around, stood up, and took a deep, satisfying breath as I gazed out the window of my office. Then I realized that I would have to play my part completely. I would have to call home to alert Syl to the coming visit of a sheriff's deputy, or else she might suspect, rightly, that I was setting her up. The home phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. This was strange. Syl was supposed to be home by this time of the afternoon. Maybe she was simply in the bathroom. I called again 5 minutes later and got the same result. I waited 10 more minutes and then left a message telling her that I would be home at about 6:15 and informed her about the call from Deputy Gibson and my lack of knowledge about anything concerning the pending visit. As I hung up, I grinned to myself, thinking about how I had sounded like an unsuspecting husband, leaving that message with just the right amount of concern in my voice. Back to Wednesday, I had allowed the fury that had built up within me to be let out in the form of ranting and yelling at my cowering and crying bride. To ensure that I did nothing more than scream, I made sure to vent my feelings to the fullest, all while Detectives O'Neill and Scurry were still around to serve as protectors of Joyce and witnesses to my restraint and not getting physical with her. After I had finished my histrionics and visibly calmed down, and after giving the detectives all the answers I could provide, I had left the front room and gone upstairs. Since I had already pretty well decided what I was planning to pack to take with me, the hasty packing of clothes and toiletries was easy. Then I had to make a great show of leaving. It did not take long before I was stomping down the stairs dramatically with my suitcase in hand and my backpack with my laptop computer and some documents I would need for a few days. Joyce was still caterwauling on the sofa in the front room. As the story had come out with the help of the 2 detectives, it would seem that my wife had been to the Newton Motel twice in her life. On both occasions, she had been there to have sex with one Bill Gerardo. The end of the second visit had been rather more eventful than she had ever imagined or expected. It would seem that after Gerardo and she had left the motel room and split up to go to their separate cars, a hooded man had appeared from behind a van parked next to Gerardo's Lexus, surprising him as he turned toward his car. The unidentified man had carried a baseball bat in one hand and had not appeared to care that Joyce saw him. For the next few minutes, the hooded man had beaten Gerardo severely, badly bruising him, breaking his left arm and right leg, and paying special attention to Gerardo's groin area once the victim was on the ground. Strangely, the assailant had not attempted to rob Gerardo. He had simply looked up at Joyce with the bat propped on his shoulder and shaken his head at her. Joyce, for her part, had remained frozen in place and speechless with terror. After the hooded man had turned and run to the lot of the adjacent convenience store and disappeared behind it, several people had begun to notice the wounded Gerardo. 1 or 2 had come over to help, while others had simply stood back and taken cell phone pictures and videos. People had finally noticed Joyce standing there, recognizing that she had been with Gerardo, and several phones had captured her image. According to witnesses, she had finally broken free of the grip of her terror and had turned in panic to get into her Corolla. It had taken quite a bit of frantic effort to get the key in the lock before she was able to unlock the door and scramble into the car. Once the engine finally turned over, she sped away from the lot with 1 or 2 people capturing images of her car, including her license plate on their phones. According to Detectives O'Neill and Scurry, Mr. Gerardo had drifted in and out of consciousness on his way to the hospital in the ambulance. He alternately mentioned the names Joyce and Amy. He was awake briefly in the regional hospital's ER, long enough to answer a couple of police questions and mention Joyce Franklin's name before he was wheeled into surgery. "So, Mrs. Franklin, once again, I need to ask, what was the nature of your meeting with Mr. Gerardo?" Detective O'Neill asked, looking expressionlessly at my wife. She swallowed and looked at me with the saddest expression I had ever seen her wear. Then, she whispered, "Doug, I am so sorry." She looked away and began crying again. Only when I started yelling at her, demanding to know what this was all about, did she finally admit that she had been at the hotel with Gerardo for sex. But I had been too insensitive to listen when she tried to explain, "It's not what you think." Yeah, I thought, right out of the infidelity manual of instructions, under things to say when you get caught cheating. That was when I began my show of going upstairs to pack and leave. I remembered all this as I drove away from our home of the past 4 years, 1 year of living together followed by 3 years of what I thought was a happy marriage. Just half an hour after the arrival of the 2 detectives, I was headed to the hotel room I had already arranged for a week's stay. Regardless of how things turned out, I needed to be away from the house right now to keep up the subterfuge. I also had to prepare myself psychologically to carry out my part of the agreement with Frank. I needed to get my game face on. Fast forward to Friday. When I got home Friday afternoon after receiving the call from Deputy Gibson, I discovered several not-so-surprising or unexpected things. First, Sybil, my wife of 8 years, was not there. Her car was gone too. After dropping my gym bag and grabbing a Yangling from the fridge in the kitchen, I noticed the blinking light on the wall phone, likely indicating a voicemail message from earlier. Passing through the den, something felt slightly off, but I was too angry to dwell on it. Climbing the stairs to our bedroom, I sat down on the bed to take off my shoes. I tossed my shirt toward the hamper, missing it, of course. I took off my pants and when I went to hang them up in the closet, I noticed that Sybil's clothes were gone. I sighed and turned back to the bedroom. Looking in her dresser, I saw that all her underwear and personal items were gone too. When I got back downstairs after dressing in slacks, a polo shirt, and moccasins, no socks, I realized why the den had seemed different. Several knickknacks, pictures, and other items belonging to Sybil were missing. Ah well, good riddance, I guess, I thought. I should have been sad. After all, we had spent a quarter of our lives together. But at the time, I was still too angry. And besides, I had a role to play in front of Deputy Gibson when he arrived shortly. "Mr. Simmons," Deputy Gibson asked, "when did you find out about your wife's affair with Mr. Philip Avery?" "My wife's what? Affair with Avery?" I put on the well-practiced look of confusion and surprise. "You mean my wife is cheating on me with him?" I took a deep breath, visibly closed my eyes for a moment, and tried my best to appear calm, though inside, I was laughing hysterically. "Deputy, I had no idea my wife was having an affair before you mentioned it just now." I opened my eyes and looked at him, rubbing my eyes with the thumb and forefinger of my right hand, the same fingers I had coated in Tabasco sauce just before the deputy rang my doorbell. My eyes were now visibly red, and tears were forming. When I addressed him, I guessed, "Is this what did you say his name was, Avery?" He nodded slightly. I whispered as I sat down heavily, "No, I had no idea." "May I speak to Mrs. Simmons, sir?" Gibson asked. "Maybe she can shed some light on our investigation." "Is she here?" "We will need her statement as well." I shook my head and tried to appear dazed. When I got home, she was gone, along with all her things. I guess she has left me. That's all I can make of this. Now is the time to switch gears emotionally. If I were to carry this off for the benefit of the deputy, it was time for the aggrieved husband to strike out in righteous anger. Just when did the sheriff's office begin investigating the dalliances of wives who screw around while their beloved and trusting husbands work to provide for them? I stood and began to pace and wave my arms to add to the dramatic look of things. Then I paused to give the deputy my best snarling look. He was obviously a veteran of many of these types of situations, as he was not fazed a bit. In fact, he looked slightly bored by the whole thing. "Mr. Simmons, we do not investigate cases of adultery or dalliances, as you call them. But we do investigate matters when those liaisons may be the instigating cause behind felony aggravated assault and battery, and possibly attempted murder," he said without raising his voice one bit. But he was watching me closely as he said all this. Once again, I put on the surprised look. To quote Captain Renault from the movie Casablanca silently in my head, "I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here, deputy. I am shocked, absolutely shocked to find out that my wife has been cheating on me. But do you really think that she hurt her lover, tried to kill him?" I asked, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. Deputy Gibson almost smiled as he drawled out, "No, I don't think that she did anything like that. What I'm trying to find out is just who else might have had a motive to do something like that. For instance," here he looked piercingly at me, "the aggrieved husband, maybe. Okay, it's Oscar time. Deputy, I assure you, I had no idea that this affair was going on, and I certainly am not a violent man. And just when did this assault supposedly take place, if I may ask?" Deputy Gibson paused for about 10 seconds, obviously gauging my response and thinking about just how much to tell me as he assessed my possible guilt in this matter. "It took place at a motel parking lot out on Lone Tree Road at about 8:30 yesterday evening. It seems that the motel has a bar attached to it, and the victim, Mr. Philip Avery, was a regular there, often meeting with Mr. Simmons. I am sad to report, Deputy Gibson really did not look sad at all about telling me this. Then he continued, "He had only had 2 drinks yesterday evening in the company of your wife, I might add. They both seemed agitated, according to the bartender. They finished their drinks and then he walked out to his car in the parking lot just a few minutes after she had left on her own. An eyewitness in the parking lot says that a man wearing a black ski mask and wielding what looked like a baseball bat assaulted Mr. Avery by striking him high in the back. Then, once the victim was on the ground, the masked man proceeded to beat Mr. Avery all over his body. He avoided the head but seemed to take particular delight in striking Mr. Avery's testicles." Here the deputy paused and seemed to wait for me to show some sign of emotion, maybe shock, outrage, or guilt. "It's been our experience, Mr. Simmons," Gibson continued again, "that this type of attack and the physical targeting of the beating is indicative of a cuckolded husband taking his revenge on his wife's lover." I couldn't help myself. I actually flinched at the word cuck, but other than that, I was able to maintain my expression combining innocence and incredulity at my circumstances. "Deputy," I finally said, "I am still trying to process all of this. So forgive me if I sound strained right now. I mean, what with my wife leaving me and finding out I let my voice trail off." The deputy gave me a look that hinted at the idea of go on and obviously looking to see if I would rise to the bait, maybe confess to something. "I can assure you that I had no connection to the incident you described last night," I said with a sigh. "Other than the connection you alleged about my wife's knowledge and relationship with this guy Avery, but last night I was in my office with my office manager, Janet Barkley, finalizing our business tax filing documents until almost 10 p.m. Just contact her and she can verify my whereabouts during the time frame you described." Deputy Gibson simply nodded and said, "Yeah, I already talked to her just after you left your office this afternoon and before coming over here. She already provided your alibi. Now I had to show anger in order not to give away anything else." "What do you mean you already talked to her? Then what was all this about asking me all of these questions and hinting that maybe I was involved?" Hey, Mr. Simmons," Gibson said, now stepping back and leaning back a bit to give himself some room to react if I got violent with him. "We have to check out everything in these cases, and you have to understand that based on many past cases of this type, the aggrieved husband is usually the primary suspect initially, until something else comes up. And now, I presume something else has come up. I mean, now that you know where I was during this assault, I asked, still showing anger but demonstrating restraint as well. Let's just say that we now need to pursue other avenues of investigation and leave it at that for now, he said, trying to rattle me. Well, I had to do the indignant bit. Now, if you have anything more to suspect me of and you wish to ask me anything, you can do so through my lawyer. Calm down, Mr. Simmons, Gibson said with upraised hands, trying to pretend that he meant to ease my hurt feelings with his gesture and still not raising his voice. I don't think it will come to that. By the way, if Mrs. Simmons does contact you, I would ask that you tell her to contact the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, and I would ask you to let me know too about any contact with her. At this, he handed me his card. Anyway, that's all I needed tonight. I truly am sorry about the situation with you and your wife and the way you had to find out and all. I'll be going now. With that, he put his Stetson on and walked to the door. As I was about to close the door on him, he turned around toward me and said I just nodded, and he turned to go. I closed the door behind him and breathed out slowly. This time, I went back into the dining room and pulled down the wild turkey instead of going into the kitchen after a beer. Taking my first sip, I silently toasted Doug and smiled. The boy had come through for me just as I had for him. Thinking of my now departed wife, I said aloud, "Sayonara." The next Wednesday, flipping through the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated did not seem to fit in with the tone that a divorce lawyer's office might want to set, but hey, I'm a guy and I like to look. So, I was thumbing through it as I sat and awaited the start of my appointment. I had checked in with the receptionist at the domestic law office of Chantel Hawk, a divorce attorney well known for her ruthless pursuit of the well-being of her clients. Word was out that she especially hated cheating wives, and the message had spread loud and clear about her among the aggrieved married male population here in Woodstock and all around Cherokee County. Other attorneys, some judges, and even a few law enforcement types quaked in their boots when she was around or sometimes just when her name came up in conversation. It was now Wednesday of the week following the violent events that had surrounded my wife's affair and her subsequent disappearance from my life. I had called to make this appointment and gotten it confirmed for today. After receiving confirmation that my initial deposit to her account via my credit card had cleared, Ms. Hawk had emailed me with a list of steps that I needed to take immediately to protect my assets and myself. If you have read any of the cheating stories on the internet, then you know about closing any joint accounts, canceling credit cards, dividing savings and checking accounts, changing insurance and retirement account beneficiaries, all the hateful and financially devastating things that must be done during the lead-up to a divorce. During all of this, I had also called Doug. He needed to know about my appointment, specifically the timing. I had deliberately arrived about half an hour early for the appointment so that we could do our own little dance of deception. As I thumbed through the magazine, looking at the babes in their swimsuits, I became aware of another person entering the office and approaching the receptionist. "Excuse me, but I may be in need of a good divorce lawyer," said a male voice, one that I knew already, but I had to pretend that I did not. I had to force myself not to look around. "Of course, sir," answered the receptionist. "And just how did you hear about Miss Hawk?" And on the questions went. She was doing her bit to verify the effectiveness of Chantel Hawk's marketing and advertising scheme. While she began to gather the prospective client's initial information, after about 3 or 4 minutes of this, the receptionist told the guy, "If you would just fill out these forms for us, we can see about getting you an appointment with Miss Hawk. She's booked up today and tomorrow, unfortunately, but we shall see what we can do about getting you in to see her on Friday." With obvious sadness and hesitation in his voice, the guy said, "Oh, okay." Pause. "But do you have a restroom I might use?" "Sure," she said to him. "It's in the main hallway of this office complex, out the door and then to your left." That was my cue. I gave the guy about a 20-second head start before putting my magazine down and standing. I smiled to the receptionist and told her, "I need to hit the gents before I go in. Please tell Miss Hawk that I am still here." "Sure thing," she said, smiling at me as I turned to go out to the main hallway. In the men's room, I saw him finishing his business at the urinal. I checked the only stall in this small men's room to ensure that we were the only two there. While he washed up at the sink, I turned back toward him. As he dried his hands, I asked him, "You okay?" Doug turned to me and gave me a strange smile. "Yeah," he said. "I just did still I never knew that I had that much rage in me until now. I have never harmed another human being the way that I did last week." He had been looking away slightly as he said this. Now he looked at me directly and said, "It kind of scares me, you know?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, I know." I had to ensure that he was on track here. We now have a legitimate reason for knowing one another, meeting at a divorce lawyer's office. "Can you keep this up as we go back inside there?" Doug nodded and said, Yeah, I can." Then he blew out a puff of air to signify that he was trying to keep calm. I grinned at him to reassure him. "Look, Doug, your situation is different from mine, and we both know it. Just remember, when you get to that third page of the questions on those forms, where they ask about counseling and the possibility of reconciliation, then, 6 months later, Doug, I am not usually a barfly, but this night was the 6-month anniversary of the venture that Frank and I had begun, our adventure together as a way to satisfy our mutual rage and get our balls back. When Frank had shown up at my workplace that first time and introduced himself to me, I had been fat, dumb, and happy, living the life of a carefree man with a good job and a beautiful and loving wife. Life couldn't have been better, or so I thought. Frank had asked me to meet him after I got off from work, as he had some information that I needed to know. When I frowned at his evasiveness, he had said he would buy me drinks and dinner if I would simply listen to what he had to say. I hesitated, but hey, free drinks and dinner don't come my way very often, and this might have been a new customer, although eccentric, maybe seeking my business. So, I had agreed. That evening, my bright, happy world was no longer bright, nor was I happy. After he finished with his tale, he drugged her. "Doug, you have to remember that and keep that foremost in your mind. She did not set out to cheat on you," Frank insisted. He had shown me pictures and transcripts that his PI had given him in a report of the investigation of Frank's cheating wife, Sile. I had not been aware, up to that point, that my wife Joyce actually worked with Sile, that they had become more than simply passing acquaintances. Joyce had actually begun to go to lunch with the slightly older Sile. It also appeared that on those days in recent weeks when Joyce had begun to stop for drinks and time to wind down on the way home from work, she had been doing so in the company of Sile as well. Evidently, Frank's PI surveillance of Sile and the subsequent electronic eavesdropping that went along with that had resulted in information relating to Joyce. At that point, Joyce, it seemed, was shocked when Sile had begun to let slip hints about the older woman's running around on her husband, Frank. While shocked, Joyce had still been somewhat excited and intrigued by all of this, but only from the point of view of someone who had been reading romance novels since her teens. I now knew that Joyce had seen all of this as excitingly naughty on Sybil's part, but Joyce would not have actually indulged in any extramarital behavior on her own. Still, she could enjoy hearing about Sybil's exploits and promising to keep them just among us girls. The two women had been stopping for drinks together for about 2 weeks. One afternoon, 2 men came over to their table and asked to join them. Joyce was about to refuse when Sybil simply scooted over and told the 2 men that they could certainly join them. Joyce had been noticeably upset, according to the PI's report, but Sybil had been visibly enjoying herself. Joyce left shortly thereafter, but the report went on to say that Sybil had adjourned to a room in the motel building adjacent to the bar with both men and had remained there for approximately 2 hours. The following week, Joyce and Sybil were once again at the same bar after work. The same 2 men, now identified in the report as Bill Gerardo and Phil Avery, came into the bar. A few minutes later, they asked to join the women again, and Sybil once again acquiesced. The report documented that Joyce and Sybil left the table for a few minutes to go to the ladies' room. During that interval, one of the men, Bill Gerardo, removed what looked like a small vial from somewhere in his clothing and poured its liquid contents into Joyce's drink, stirring it with his finger. He then said something to Avery, and they high-fived and smiled as the ladies returned about 20 minutes later. After finishing her drink and reaching for her purse, Joyce appeared to be slightly uncoordinated in her movements. Sybil sought to ascertain her welfare, receiving a confused look in response from Joyce. The two men offered to help get Joyce to a place where she could lie down and recover before attempting to drive anywhere. The PI's report indicated that, unsurprisingly, the men just happened to have a motel room available next door. "Yeah, I know he drugged her the first time, Gerardo, I said. It was her letting him blackmail her into coming back a second time without being drugged that pissed me off. But what really got me was the fact that she didn't trust me enough to tell me about what was going on and let me help her out of the mess she had gotten into with that shitbird." I had to take a sip of my drink to calm down. I'm her husband, for God's sake. She's supposed to trust me enough to let me defend her, to take care of her. What kind of a man does that make me if I can't protect my own wife, if she doesn't even trust me enough to let me? We remained quiet for a moment as we each looked at our drinks on the bar before us. "You enjoying still working things out, despite all of that?" Frank asked, nursing wild turkey meat while I was enjoying an arrogant prick ale. "Yeah, I'm still pissed at her a little bit though," I said as I took another pull on the larger-than-usual bottle, "but I'll get over it soon. I got her into assault trauma counseling right after things came out in the open, and the outfit that handles her counseling also does couples marriage counseling, so we've been doing that as well for the past 10 weeks. You know that Sybil was deep into it with those two jokers. She probably was the one who suggested using date rape drugs on your wife," Frank said to me, still trying to offer support. "Yeah, I know. We went over that together months ago. By the way, did you ever hear from Sybil?" I asked. "Nah," Frank responded, then took another sip. "It's as if she's vanished from the face of the earth. But when her money runs out, I expect I'll hear from her, or maybe from a lawyer acting on her behalf. Meanwhile, I still have that divorce paperwork that I started with Chantel Hawk. Chantel says that I can modify the grounds for divorce from adultery to irreconcilable differences or even to abandonment if she stays out of touch for long enough. No skin off my nose either way." Frank was obviously still carrying a lot of anger around with him. Frank would never admit, and I wasn't going to be the one to tell him, that he could only be that angry if he still carried around some quantity of love for his ex despite her cheating ways. Yeah, I had picked up a couple of tidbits of knowledge about that kind of thing during the counseling sessions. "Well," I said with a grin, "at least you got the formal separation paperwork and so that you're legally free to lower your white count if you need to without getting a countersuit for adultery." Frank grinned back at me and lifted his glass in my direction. "You got that right." Then he took another sip and looked off into space for a couple of seconds. "Let me ask you," Frank went on, "are you and Joyce finally back to doing, the deed?" I smiled and simply nodded. I was not going to go into details about our sex life. After all, this had come out in the open. It had taken a couple of months before we had finally gotten together for sex after all of that, and only after she had been in counseling for a while. But man, the changes. It was as if Joyce could not do enough for me in her guilt-ridden efforts to make things up to me. Sex in any way I liked, and I had finally gotten her number. It turns out that the son of a Gerardo had been the first one to the summit, so to speak, on that one. But I was taking advantage of it. Now, I just had to make sure that I did not overdo it. Movement behind us, along with the clearing of a throat, made us turn away from the bar together. A woman stood there in a very sexy dark green cocktail dress. It showed off quite a bit of her ample cleavage and revealed quite a bit of thigh due to the slit up one side. Frank and I both were speechless as we gazed at this vision of, what is that British term? Oh yeah, sex on legs. So, she said, you two do know each other. It seemed something clicked, a stirring of recognition. Then it hit me. Sergeant O'Neill, as I live and breathe. Wow, I never suspected that a policewoman would look as nice as you do off duty. I was trying to keep my tongue from doing two things, letting it run away with itself and giving away what Frank and I had done together, or hanging out in an obvious display of lust at this vision standing before us. Actually, it's Lieutenant O'Neill now, but that is just the name I go by professionally. When I am out with my husband, I am simply Mrs. Gibson, she said, just as a well-built and well-dressed man stepped over to join her. I did not recognize him, but I detected that Frank suddenly stiffened. Hello, Mr. Simmons, the man said. I see my wife introduced herself to you. Then he looked at me and stuck out his hand. Jeff Gibson, was all he said as I took his hand and shook it. He had a purposeful but not overly aggressive grip. Frank cleared his throat and said, this is Deputy Sheriff Gibson I was telling you about, who investigated the case involving my soon-to-be ex-wife a few months ago. I raised my eyebrows but did not say anything to that. And I investigated the case involving Mr. Franklin and his wife for the Woodstock PD right about the same time, said Lieutenant O'Neill. Well, Mrs. Deputy Gibson, I guess. She looked slightly amused as her gaze went from Frank's face back to me. I was working very hard to keep my expression neutral. Frank interjected, since we discovered that our wives knew each other and had been, involved with the men involved in those incidents that happened at that time, we stayed in touch. Now, we meet once in a while to share the misery, so to speak, except I took up the case, trying not to let this drag out. Frank's wife simply ran off and disappeared. My wife and I are trying to patch things up and move on. Lieutenant O'Neill smiled thinly at me and said, and the missus and I are trying to fix things. By the way, we still have an open case file on the attack on Mr. Gerardo. She paused to see if I would respond. When I simply grimaced and took a pull from my beer bottle, she went on. He is still in rehabilitation for his leg, but it appears that he will have a limp for the rest of his life. His arm is doing well though, it is a good thing he is right-handed. I did not really give a damn about the recovery or lack thereof of Bill Gerardo, but I simply nodded. His wife, Amy, divorced him, taking their 2 kids and a significant portion of his finances. Additionally, it appears that his reproductive capabilities, while still operational, suffer from reduced potency. The low motility of his sperm makes it challenging for him to father more children if he chooses to remarry. She seemed to exude a sense of satisfaction about it herself. Even female cops, it seems, relish seeing deceitful men get their comeuppance. Yeah, Deputy Gibson interjected, Frank, if you ever happen to speak with your ex, let her know that we still have the case open regarding Mr. Avery's assault. While his injuries weren't as severe as Mr. Gerardo's, he did incur substantial medical expenses. Interestingly, these coincided with Wendy serving him divorce papers. Frank grunted in response, remarking, couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Both Deputy Gibson and his wife exchanged glances with us, wearing amused expressions as silence settled in. Well, y'all have yourselves a good night now, here? Deputy Gibson said, leading his wife out the door. Frank and I returned to the bar, drinking in silence for a few minutes before he glanced around and quietly asked me, you did get rid of that bat, right? Thank you all for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed them, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.